All right, let's get going. I'm going to go over a lot of information, a lot of different examples. Don't worry about having to try to write everything down. I'll post a link to the slides on my Twitter account located here. I'm a partner at Y Combinator. What that means is I help pick out the startups that we invest in. We provide seed funding to companies at their earliest stages. My background's in user experience design, product management, front-end engineering, copywriting, and user acquisition. So far, we've funded about 617 startups, and 511 of those has gone on to raise money, and they've raised a collective $1.7 billion from venture capitalists and angels. 287 of them have valuations and are estimated to be worth about $11.7 billion. And like most sort of venture capital portfolios, the value of our companies follow sort of a power law distribution. 10 of our startups represent $8.6 billion of that worth. And what a lot of people are sort of interested in is, like, how does Y Combinator sort of foster and develop companies that become worth $1 billion? And it turns out that billion-dollar companies at the stage that we look at them look like everyone else, every other company. And that is, before they launch, before they go out there and try to get users, they're focused all of their energy on the act of creation. This beautiful sort of moment where co-founders, the technical co-founders, gets to build something from nothing. And for them, it's usually a pretty magical point. The turning point for these companies and the things that will make them different are the things that they do after launch. And for a lot of people, especially first-time entrepreneurs, they don't realize that a lot of your startup is focused on working on and implementing and figuring out problems that have nothing to do with just building the product. And how you handle this situation is sort of the difference to us. Now, the way we sort of look at it and the way we believe things should be handled is the best way to help companies get to $1 billion is to have them think differently about making their first dollar. A lot of what we sort of teach people are basic values that they take on to sort of figure out how to grow both their product, their user base, and eventually their company. One of the strategies that we try to teach our startups is to do things that don't scale. Now, don't misunderstand me. What we don't tell them to do is go out there and frivolously and exorbitantly go through your resources and spend money as fast as possible. The idea is actually behind doing and implementing extraordinary measures in order to attract your first passionate users, to get your first sort of dollar. Now, this was an essay that was put out by Paul Graham a couple months ago to sort of show some of the ideas and some examples from some of our companies. But I thought I'd take some time to talk about my experience going through Y Combinator back in the winter of 2006. Back then, my company was part of the second ever batch in Y Combinator. It was the very first one located in Silicon Valley. And in YC, we built a product called Wufoo. Wufoo is an online form builder, helps create contact forms, design online surveys. It's basically a database app that looks like it was designed by Fisher-Price. It looks like a toy almost. But while it was deceptively easy to use, it was fairly versatile and useful. Every single industry, market, and vertical used Wufoo, including a number of name brands that you probably have heard of. In 2011, we were acquired by SurveyMonkey, and there's some interesting characteristics about that sort of transaction. At the time, we were only 10 people big after operating the company for about 5 years. However, while we did go through Y Combinator in Silicon Valley and then raised some money, we actually moved back to Tampa, Florida. For the rest of the 5 years, the length of the company was located not in the place where most people think startups sort of go and grow. Additionally, we had no central office. Our team was completely remote. Everyone worked from home. However, we were this interesting characteristic. As far as this transaction goes, TechCrunch put out this graph that shows a bunch of companies, and on one axis, on the bottom horizontal axis, it shows the amount of funding that they took when they first got started. And on the vertical axis, it shows the valuation of the company at acquisition or IPO. And we're this outlier way over to the far right. And to best illustrate this, I'll kind of summarize. The average startup on that main line raises $25.3 million and returns back to their investors 676%. Wufoo only raised $118,000, and our returns to our investors was 29,000%. The trick was sort of in the way YC taught us to look at like doing our company. And when we went out to start and build Wufoo, we knew that we want to build any kind of software. We wanted software that people wanted to love, that people wanted to have a relationship with. Human beings, from sort of our observations, were relationship manufacturing creatures. We cannot help but anthropomorphize and create relationships with the things we interact with over and over and over again. Whether it's the tools that you use every single day, the products that you buy, the cars that you drive, or the software that you're playing around with on the internet, we assign personality characteristics. We have a way of interacting with them in a very specific way. And if those sort of conventions of how human relationships work break down with those companies or those products or services, then the relationships break down as well. And from this, we tried to organize and figure out a system for handling this in a systematic way. And the way we looked at building relationships with our users wasn't done in sort of an autistic, Asperger-y kind of way. We looked at the science and the research behind what it takes to do dating and how to handle long-term relationships, and we applied that to sort of the model of how we approach new users and how we kept our existing users on the platform. Now, when it comes to dating, the trick is first impressions. And I'll illustrate this really simply. If you are on a first date with someone and you catch them picking their nose in the middle of dinner, that's probably going to be the end of that relationship. You have an expectation for how you expect people to behave, and the standards are so much higher. And what's interesting about that is that these first moments, these first impressions that we have in relationships, they're the word of mouth story. If I ask you to tell me about your first kiss, the first time you made love, how you proposed to your significant other, right? You would have that story on hand. You would have it rehearsed, because they're the stories that you tell over and over and over again, right? And so there's no different when it comes to sort of products and services on the internet. Now, the first moments or impressions for most companies, they focus on these things, and they're basic ones. They're the ones that are the most obvious. But there's so many other first moments that you can take your time to try to impress people in a significant way. Things like your first email, how the interface looks when they don't have anything built on top of it. Every link they sort of interact with the first time they interact with customer support. Now, the way we approach making our first impressions actually comes from a philosophy or sort of a standard that was developed by the Japanese. For the Japanese, when you build something or manufacture something, they actually have two words for quality to say whether something is good or not. Atarime Henshitsu and Miryokateki Henshitsu. Now, the first one means taken for granted quality. And that's basically the basic functionality of the thing or the object. Does it just do what you expect it to do? Miryokateki Henshitsu, however, best translates to enchanting quality. And what that means is that does it work in a way that brings both pleasure to the user and the people who are going to interact with it? So I can give you an example. You can make a pen, like a big pen, like it does what it does, puts ink onto the paper, right? Or you can make like a Mont Blanc pen. The weight of the pen, the way it looks, the feel of it in your hands, the way the ink writes onto the paper, and the way the handwriting, the words, and the drawings look that comes from that pen brings pleasure both to the person that's using it and the people that will view sort of the writings and the illustrations that come from it. There's a difference there. In order to achieve great quality in products, the Japanese believe they must satisfy both conditions. I can give some examples here. This is Vimeo. This is their login page. Obviously, part of the product spec does not require it to have a beautiful sort of illustration like this kind of care. There's another example of a modal login interface. And what it does is it sets the tone for their site that we're going to be a little bit different from the other video sharing websites that you see out there. Now, it doesn't have to just come from visual identity characteristics. Sometimes you can do brilliant things with microcopy. This is the sign-up form for a wine-sharing social network called Corked. I think it's not really around anymore, but this is the copy on the sign-up page. Email address. It's also your login. It's also your sign-in, and it has to be legit. First name, what your mom calls you. Last name, what your army buddies call you. Password, something you remember but hard to guess. Password confirmation, type it again. Think of it as a test. It's literally a poem as you fill out the form, right? This is the very first time you interact with it, and already you know, like, this is going to be different. This is going to be special. And it helps set the tone for people that this is something that they're going to remember from this point forward. Now, contrast this with Yahoo's login form. Like, what does this say about the personality, about the kind of relationships they're expecting from you? And one of the things that's disappointing to me about this form is that Flickr had a really great login form before they got acquired by Yahoo. Their call to action was, get in there. A sort of really exciting, exuberant sort of tone done with something as simple as just changing the text on the button. Now, First Moments comes in all different shapes and sizes. And so one of the places that we tend to ignore people is in our manuals. And so a lot of times what we have is our best marketing people work on the brochures that sell our products and services. But when it comes to the documentation, the thing that people will interact with every single time, the thing that they're going to need to actually use your service, we relegate it to second-hand graphic, sort of. And it really goes to show that you can make a big difference in this. So MailChimp is one of the great examples of this. They took all of their help documentation and guides, and they created these beautiful book covers for each of the different types. And the result is readership of their documentation went up. People went and actually learned how to use the software a lot better because they made it this engaging, this exciting. Other things can be midi-kateki in terms of conscientiousness of sort of flow and action. This is the documentation for Stripe. They're an API service. And when it comes to API services, your interface is your documentation. It's the only way that developers sort of understand and how to work with you. And what Stripe decided to do was that their documentation was going to be the best. Now, if you're a developer and you're working with code snippets like these all the time, one of the things that's sort of a pain is you have to change out the authentication details, like the API key here, with the one that's your own. What Stripe decided to do was, if you're already logged in to Stripe, what they do is they automatically take your authentication key and they put it inside of all the different examples for you. And the result is that it's quite literally copy and paste straight from these snippets once you're logged into your system. And it's one less step and one step quicker for you to start integrating their payment system into your service. Sometimes the way you decide to roll out and sort of market new services can be a way to show midi-kateki. A couple years ago, we released the third version of our API for Wufoo. We wanted to make it a development platform, but we were trying to think of ways that were outside of the box to get people to build on top of it. Now, most people, what they like to do is have a hackathon or have a contest to have people build products on top of it and give away things like iPads or iPhones or what have you. But we wanted to think outside of that, something that reflected the personality and the relationships that we had. The founders at Wufoo are big medieval nuts. We love going to places like medieval times, and we just thought it would be appropriate if we had something that was reflective of that personality. So we contacted the people over at armor.com and said, can you forge us a custom-built battle axe? And the result was our API contest said that if you win first place, you win a friggin' medieval battle axe. The results were lots of word of mouth. As you can imagine, we have tons of developers submitting apps. We had over 25 different amazing submissions take place. Things like an iPhone app, an Android app, a WordPress plugin, things that we could not have built ourselves in the time frame and budget we had assigned for the contest, and all because we changed the way that people were going to talk about their first time interacting with our API. I can probably go on and on about tons of different examples of this. If you want to see other great examples of companies doing incredible midi-kateki moments, I highly recommend reading this blog called Little Big Details. And they're just screenshots of different apps and services and the little things that the designers had done sort of make things stand out and show that they were conscientious of it. When it comes to long-term relationships or marriages, there's no better expert than John Gottman. He's a researcher of marriages up in Seattle, Washington. And he has an interesting trick that he can do. He can videotape a married couple fighting about an issue for 1 hour and predict with an 85% accuracy rating of whether that couple would be together or not 4 years down the road. Now, if you increase that video up to an hour and then have them also talk about their hopes and their dreams, his prediction rating goes up to 94%. Now, they show these same videos to marriage counselors, sociologists, psychologists, evaluators, other successfully married couples, and those people couldn't predict better than random chance. So John Gottman's research, which has been featured in This American Life and Malcolm Gladwell's books, illustrates that he sees something. And the way we fight about issues determines the longevity of how long we're going to be together. Now, one of the insights he discovered was it wasn't that successfully married couples don't fight whatsoever. It turns out everybody fights. And we all fight about the exact same things. We fight about money, kids, sex, time, and others. And others are things like jealousy and in-laws. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can actually map each of these issues to customer support problems that happens in every single startup. So reasons people leave you or don't use your service, the cost or billing issues in the system. If you are a tool or service that works with people's clients, anything that affects them, people are extremely sensitive about. Performance, it's about how long you're up and how fast. And roadmap is the features that you're working on for the future. And I said jealousy and in-laws. So that is competition and partnerships. Anything weird that goes on there, people complain. What I love about this is that for a typical conversion funnel for most startups, customer support is the things that happens between each one of these steps. Those issues are the reason people don't convert and give you the kind of metrics that you're interested in. So the trick is, how do you handle fighting? And that will increase conversion rates and reduce churn. So how did we approach it at Wufoo? Well, we had an observation based on sort of our experience working with other companies and seeing how other people worked. And what we noticed was that software designers or software builders are divorced from the consequences of the actions. The people who make the software are not involved or not held accountable when it's time to support it. And the problems are basically technical co-founders, they love that 100% creation magic moment so much that when the company gets any kind of traction, they immediately silo their company, break things off, and have other people take care of it. And it distances them from the very people that's going to help make their startup successful. So what we decided was we wanted to add 3 core values to our software development process. We wanted to have responsibility, accountability, and a sense of humility to this process that a lot of companies don't really think about. And the way we fixed it is through something we called support-driven development. And it's no different than other agile development practices, like test-driven development or what have you. It's about quality control. How do we build software that is of high quality, that works at scale, and works reliably? And the way it works is really simple. You have one rule. You just make everyone do customer support. And in our company, that was it. You had to support the people that pay your paycheck. If you're a software engineer, if you're a founder, if you're a marketing person, the bookkeeper, everyone had to do a shift of customer support. And what it does is it fixed the feedback loop. Now the creators are the supporters, and you can scale in a very interesting sort of way. Now, we're not the first company to think of this. One of the best examples I can think of is from kayak.com. The founder, Paul English, actually installed a red customer support telephone in the middle of their engineering floor. And when it would go off, engineers would have to answer that sort of phone support. And a lot of people would ask Paul English while he was doing this startup, it's like, Paul, why would you pay engineers $100,000, $150,000 to answer phone support that you can easily outsource to call centers like overseas for much less the cost? And Paul would look at them and say, well, after the second or third time that the phone rings for the same problem, the engineer tends to stop what they're doing, work on the code, fix the issue, and then we don't get phone calls about it anymore. Now, at the time that we got acquired, Wufoo had about 500,000 users supported by our 10-person team. Now, the ecosystem of Wufoo had about 5 million people using Wufoo forums and reports, whether they knew it or not. And a lot of them would have questions or just general queries about how things worked. On average, we got about 400 issues a week. That resulted in about 800 emails sent by us on average. But our response time was 7 to 12 minutes, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day. And from 9 p.m. to midnight, you'd get a response within an hour. And then on the weekends, you wouldn't go longer than 24 hours. Again, we were not an international startup. We're all located in Tampa, Florida. And we had an international sort of user base. And we supported all of them with this sort of response. Now, the trick to this and scaling is about focusing on internal tools, but also like helping users help themselves. Things like frequently asked questions, tons of tool tips built into the app, redesigning our documentation over and over again to optimize for reduction in support. This recent version reduced our customer support by 30% overnight. And all has to do with having easy to follow navigation, lots of screencasts, lots of screenshots, and just basically keeping this up to date over and over again. We built in processes like, hey, before you can release a feature out to your users, documentation must be written ahead of time. The other result of having a support-driven culture in a company is that you have your engineers doing interesting experiments. So we had saw a talk by one of my favorite speakers, Kathy Sierra, at a conference in Miami. And she talked about there's this disconnect between the tone of the company when they're doing customer support from the internet, right, and the feelings that people have when they're frustrated about the product or service that they use. If you go to the support center of, let's say, Target, and you're visibly upset, people react differently. They behave appropriately, right? And she postulated until we have face recognition on the internet, we won't ever get that close. Well, we were a form builder, and while we couldn't build face recognition software, we thought maybe we can start with a drop-down and just ask people what they thought. And so we added this simple little thing to the forums called an emotional state, and it just asks people, what do you feel? And what's interesting about this is our hypothesis at the time was nobody was going to fill this out. We just wanted to see what would happen. It wasn't required, what have you. The emotional state drop-down field was filled out 75.8% of the time by our users, which is pretty good, much higher than we expected. The most surprising thing, though, is the browser type drop-down field was only filled out 78.1% of the time. Basically, our users were telling us, hey, for my technical support problem, knowing how I feel about this is just as important to me as knowing the type of technical details that I have that helps you debug the problem. The other thing that was interesting that we noticed after a couple of months of having this form out was it seemed like our users were a lot nicer. Like, the requests that were coming in were a lot friendlier and rational, and we were like, something's different here, and we don't exactly know what it was. So the way to quantify it, we dig through the data and did some text analysis, and basically the conclusion was this. When it comes to expressing human emotions in written form, there's only so many different ways that you can make it happen. Exclamation marks, curse words, all caps words. And so we tracked all of those info and did a tech analysis and all of that stuff. And turns out on all 3 metrics, all of them were down after we released this emotional state drop-down field. So basically, our users had an outlet for their emotions, and therefore, when they told us what their problems was, didn't have to resort to all these weird, crazy tactics to show us that it was urgent. The other thing that John Gottman noticed was that there's a second group of people that would divorce like 15 years down the line. Everything will look fine, and then bam, as soon as the kids go to college, they separate. And it took them a long time to figure out what was in the videotapes that showed that these people were going to break up in such a fashion. And it turns out the problem was relationships are kind of like the second law of thermodynamics. In the closed energy system, things will run down if you don't constantly put energy into them. And so for long-term relationships, for companies that do especially subscription-based services and think in the long term for customer lifetime value, you have to constantly be working on ways to show your users that you appreciate them. So we do typical things. We had a great blog and awesome email newsletter. But the readership rates, basically, while they were above average for most other startups, were still relatively low. For our email campaigns, it'd still only be read by 30, 35% of our user base, right? People didn't know all the awesome things that we were building for them. So we set to work on building a new internal tool. It's called the Wufoo Manager Alert System. And all it is fairly simple. You every single feature that got built for Wufoo got a timestamp and a description added to it. And what we would do is, when the user logs in, we would figure out what are all the new features that have been implemented since the last time the user logged in, and then we would show them a customized views of all the things that we did for them because we cared. And the result is, this is single-handedly the most appreciated and talked about feature that I see or hear about when I meet other people who use Wufoo. People love that we're constantly working and doing things for them behind the scenes. That even though they pay the same price every single month, they're getting increased value increasingly. Showing people in unexpected ways and in a regular sort of fashion that you're doing things for them and making sure that they know about it is crucial to having those long-term relationships feel strong and be renewed over time. The other thing that we did, in addition to making everyone support the people that pay their paychecks, was to thank the people that pay their paychecks. And this was in an effort to continue to show humility within the system, because the things that we were doing and accomplishing could not be done without our users. And we wanted to make sure that with our employees and inside of our culture, people wouldn't forget that. At Wufoo, we only had one sort of mandatory meeting a week. We had all meetings assigned on a Friday, and we had a 4.5-day work week. And part of the process of going through all the weekly scrum and doing biz dev deals and handling the sort of business at hand is we would make everyone spend some time writing handwritten thank you cards to our customers. Nothing really fancy. They're just a note card, the word thanks written on them, and a dinosaur sticker placed on the front. These pictures come from our users, passionate users who post us in appreciation of sort of what we were doing on there. And the results are that I worked with a company and a group of people that were willing to do anything, sort of make their job possible, but they also extremely appreciated sort of the impact that they were having on the people that they were working for. So in customer support, by doing fast customer support, they realized, hey, I make a difference here. By writing these thank you cards, they realized, hey, this is what I'm doing this for, and I'm never going to sort of forget and sort of lose my way as a result. Now, where it comes really sort of interesting is that, okay, yeah, you did all this kind of stuff, but what does it mean? What does it actually look like when it comes to the numbers? And this is our user growth curve for the first 4 years of Wufoo. We spent $0 on any sort of traditional marketing campaign, nothing on ads, nothing on traditional branding stuff. Everything was for organic word-of-mouth growth, and it had to do with sort of how we approached our customers. The thing that I'm most proud of, however, is not the graph up top, but the graph down below. The reason we were able to stay a small, intimate company that allowed to have an incredible profit-sharing program is because we had a support curve that looked like this, that grew at a linear rate, even though we were growing at this sort of interesting geometric shape. The things that it took to sort of architect and make that happen allowed us to be a much better service and product company, and had a sort of an incredible sort of change in the culture and sort of how things got managed and completed. That just because you get customer intimate and focused doesn't mean you have to sacrifice the kind of growth that you see in other startups. Now, that was a lot of lovey-dovey stuff that I talked about, so I'll leave you with some research that was compiled and gathered together by some Harvard Business Review researchers, Michael Treacy and Fred Wizierma. And they wrote an article called The Discipline of Market Leaders. And what they noticed was there's only 3 ways to achieve market dominance in any industry vertical or market that you're interested in. And depending on how you decide to achieve market dominance, you have to architect your company in a very specific way to make that happen. So the 3 ways are best price, best product, and best overall solution. So if you want to be a company that dominates the market through best price, you focus your company on logistics. These are things that you see that Walmart and Amazon do. If you want to be a company that dominates based on the best product, you focus all your energies on R&D, which is things that you see Apple do. Now, if you want to be a company that dominates based on overall solution, you focus on something called being customer intimate. And this is the path that's followed by hospitality industries and luxury brands. And what I love about this strategy is that of all the ones that's accessible to every startup out there, regardless of sort of the resources at hand, the amount of money you have for the people, being customer intimate is something that everyone can sort of be focused on and sort of achieve market dominance in that fashion.
My last point is to remind you constantly that even though you're not in Silicon Valley and you don't have access to capital, or you might feel like you don't have enough money, that you can make sort of what you need occur and happen. The people that I meet with who complain to me about they don't have enough money, they're not in Silicon Valley, they don't have like the right kind of people, or they don't have whatever, they're focused on resources. And people who focus on resources and thinking like that's the path to success are bound to fail. The people we look for at Y Combinator and the values and skills that we foster in them are people who are focused on resourcefulness. People who say, you know what, if I'm smart enough, if I'm sort of charming enough, if I'm intelligent enough, if I am determined enough, there's no obstacle that I can't overcome, then I can give them a small amount of seed funding, and I know they're going to do whatever is possible to get out there, do things that don't scale, and succeed. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.